Happy Friday. How's everybody feeling? Good. Any plans for the weekend? 6 wax tonight. What time are you calling? Oh, okay, Fright Fest. Yes, sir. Cool. I haven't been in that in a long time. Okay. How was the quiz? Not bad. Okay. Yeah, I didn't try to make it, too difficult for you. Try to keep it general sort of information. Did you receive the instructions and a rubric for the presentations on Blackboard? Any questions about that? Yes.
I just have one small concern.
Mm-hmm.
So someone else put that they were group 3, but we are group 2. Which one's group 3?
Okay. Somebody emailed me. Was that you who emailed me about the combined groups? Okay. All right, don't worry about it. That's not a big deal, right? Because you still know who's in your group, right? All right, so I'll worry about the sequence. But what you're saying is over here is 3 groups, not 2.
Yeah, it was 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. All right. Group 2, who's in the second group? 2 or 1? 2? Who's in your group? Okay. Have you already started anything or? Okay. Cool. All right. Well, yeah. I'll look over it for the weekend to figure out the correct schedule, how we're going to do that. So we'll have them every Wednesday because, no one wants to give a presentation first thing Monday morning. And I'm looking at the discussions just to make sure we don't overlap in topics so it's not repetitive, talking about the same thing. Hopefully someone's able to, look ahead and cover death and dying. I think that's pretty interesting, right? Advanced age, not just infant, early childhood stuff. Hopefully people are covering teenage years or something else, social emotional things and midlife crisis, things of that nature. Try to get creative, right? It doesn't have to be completely textbook. Right? You can think of midlife crisis, people who are of advanced age, the issues, the changes they go through. You can even think of very specific situations, like high school, particularly high school, right? Cognitive development, social problems, things of that, emotional problems, things of that nature. Okay, those are going to be exciting. And then I'll upload another discussion question today. And, of course, you'll have until Monday to complete it. Okay, let's continue on. All right, so neonatal, new to life. What are we trying to figure out here? Well, we're trying to figure out what are the basic principles to be able to survive. What would be considered normal for an infant or a toddler in terms of their development, right? Because we know if things go wrong here, essentially we will have a child with some sort of deficit, right? Developmentally, cognitively, emotionally. People could be classified as autistic because their social, emotional issues within the classroom, not being able to organize your thoughts, right? Not being able to recall, memorize things. So that's what we're trying to figure out. Other thing we're trying to figure out, hey, new to life, how does one recognize a self, right? We're older now, so we understand that there's a me, there's a you. I have my internal universe on how I think, what I believe, what I feel. You have yours. And in order for all of this to work, we kind of have to understand one another, right? So how does an infant get from being born to being able to have a concept of self and others? Huge. Third part, language. extremely important. If you can't understand what people in your environment are saying, you essentially will be at a huge deficit, right? So we need to communicate. How do we communicate? Think of the magic in that. How are we able to develop language? What's the theory behind understanding this vast system of vocabularies, right? Thousands of languages around the world, right? How is one able to make sense? Are we constructed out, like we say, through pictures in our mind as mental representations, and then we sort of speak it out, and it's supposed to go into our mind to be processed and stored to repeat it back later on sometime. This is fundamentally what we're trying to understand for the infant, right? So it's able to understand a few things. Space. We saw that with the visual cliff. Do the babies understand what space is? Depth, length, width, right? Gravity. Will an infant be able to understand the concept of time? Yesterday, today, right? Maybe the infant definitely can't understand the future, which we can. We try to plan it, right? We could try to understand it based on the past. But how does an infant get to this point, right? We're saying 0 to 2 years of age. Other things, right? And we live in a society governed by rules and instruction, which is like, hey, yes, no. How do you know that? Shake your head, yes, no. All right, how do we program our baby to get that? How do we go from goo goo gaga to speaking full words? Right? So this is kind of what we're trying to figure out. And a lot of this is theoretical, right? We don't have a true sense, but that's a lot of the science is theoretical. It's our best understandings of kind of how things are. So take that also into consideration. So Piaget thought that essentially infants have very little pre-wiring inside of their brains, right? But essentially a blank slate so that you can train the child to be anything you want. You could program the child like you could with software to learn any language that you want, right? To behave any way that you want it to. Others kind of disagree. Others say, hey, you know what? There has to be some evolutionary pre-wiring inside of all of us at birth in order for us to give us the capacity, the capabilities to understand language acquisition, to be able to maneuver our bodies in a way that's helpful and adaptive, right? So we say there's competing ideas, but usually we go with Piaget because Piaget is kind of the standard for elementary school, even I would say elementary school and pre-K, right? They kind of use his theories for learning. All right, memory. Hey, memory is important. How can you recall? If you can't recall, then how do you learn, right? If you can't have a repository of information, right? How can you learn? How can you connect new things with old things, right? And so we say we start with sensory memory. Your environment is given information. You can't see it, just like you can't see the air, but it still exists. It's given information to your body through skin cells, through your eyes, through your ears, through your fingers, toes, all of this, right? And we use that information probably for basic survival mechanisms, right? But we say, unfortunately, it's not that simple because we are social animals. Human beings are social. So we need to be highly interactive with one another. So we need more stuff because we create inventions and rules and conventions and all these things. So we got to have working memory, things that require mental effort, right? Which requires focus. So think of this concept, right? You're this human being in this meat sack, right? This vessel that you're in. It never turns off, right? Constantly rolling. You're constantly doing something, right? Shaking your leg, touching your face, typing, It never stops, right? But you're like, well, how do you pick up information? Well, you have to focus, which maybe be awareness. We call it fixed attention. You have to fix your attention in order for you to take in probably important information. All right, well, how do we have attention? Well, it has to be stimulating. If it's not stimulating, you drift. You see this with yourself. Then every second that passes by, not stimulating, you drift. Not just your body drift, your mind drifts. You're off somewhere else. You're not here, right? And then when something comes interesting, boom, you're back here again, right? So it's kind of like, think of the mind almost as a spotlight, constantly scanning the environment, and then something sticks, right? And we get that information. And then, right, okay, understood. Scan again, like a spotlight. And then it sticks, right? So we have to kind of train the infants to have this fixed attention. Else, nothing will stick, right? And so we could kind of describe that as the central executive, but really central executive is all your cognitive abilities and how they're processed. So you could look at that almost as like a computer processing. Long-term memory. Let me say long-term memory is permanent, but it's not easy to get there. It requires repetition over and over and over. You may need to hear the same words 1,000 times. You need to maybe touch things X amount of times for it finally to cross over a threshold to go into long-term memory. Long-term memory means you could recall it 90 years from now, right? Let me say if it's highly stimulating, which is both positive and negative. You could think of trauma. 90-year-old complaining about what happened to them at 5 years old. And they could recall it like it happened yesterday, right? Right, well, highly stimulating, but in a negative sense, right? It needs to be familiar, contextual. Maybe it could be a cultural thing, right? That never goes away. But it's something that we need, or that we value rather, that needs to be permanent for us, right? Something that needs to be permanent. Think of all our automated systems are really stored in long-term memory, right? And we said we have a baseline called homeostasis. It's your zero. We're never really there, but the goal of life is to try to always stay as close as we can to homeostasis, right? To your balance. When you're out of that, you experience stress or anxiety, however you want to describe it, which is why you shake your leg in class, right? Like, why are you trying to soothe yourself? You're like, well, this is human life. We're constantly trying to get to balance. Your body will automatically shake its leg. You'll touch your face, touch your nose, touch your hair to soothe. Right? What am I soothing? Unconscious anxiety and stress, right? Never stops, once again, right? So we say, hey, these are things to really get us back to a really good balance, right? And this is why we do these things. The human body is formed of energy, and the energy needs to go somewhere. If it doesn't go anywhere, you burst with anxiety and stress and lash out at people, scream at people, things like that nature, right? Needs to go somewhere. All right, so attention, right? So we say attention. It's just a sense of awareness of an object, of things, of even a mental representation, right? We need to be able to focus. Some methods of studying attention or awareness, right? We have an infant, let's say 5 months old, and we could hold up an interesting object we think is interesting, right? And we scan the eyes. Thus the eyes drift. As you look in that way, I want to have this over here, right? If a baby, an infant, doesn't pay attention to something like highly stimulated, it could be a vivid color or something, then we can say, well, there's something going on. If it's a constant sort of looking away. The most powerful source of information is the eyes, right? Human beings are primarily visual, right? That's our largest form of sensory. So we could use different tests. We could study babies just with simple eye movements, on certain things like that, right? And so we know that, hey, a lack of attention means a lack of brain development. Because if you're not able to have fixed awareness of something, that means you won't retain information for it to either be working memory or stored in long-term memory, right? To be the storehouse of information. You will be very random with scarce, limited information over time. Pupil size as indicator. And we say the eyes are the primary source. When you're walking down the street, you see somebody late at night on the same block as you walking, you make a 0.5-second judgment if somebody's a threat or not, right? You do it visually. You don't hear it, you may not hear them, they're too far away. You can't touch them, they're too far away. You make a visual sort of process of like, hey, this is threatening or non-threatening, right? And you do that by, hey, prior archetypes, right? You say, hey, there's different types of mental representation, concepts in my mind of people who look threatening. And there's different types of people, concepts in my mind, mental representation, people who don't look threatening, right? So late at night, and see someone with a hoodie on, just a figure, right? We don't have to see your face or anything. Which means you'll just be a heightened awareness. You may not cross the street, but you're like, oh, let me pay attention now. I wasn't paying attention. Listen to my AirPods, right? So we say, hey, in our mind, also the information we begin to categorize. We classify, categorize, and organize information, right? What's important? What's not so important? What do I have to keep at the forefront of my memory? What do I have to keep just way in the back that really don't matter, but it's good to just know at some point in time, right? Working memory capacity is important too, right? Because we say working memory involves that prefrontal cortex in which we're able to solve problems, right? And so we do this with different types of testing. Comprehension tests. How can a baby comprehend? And if we're saying baby, we're still talking about infants, maybe 18 months, 24 months. By that time, they're actually talking words, right? So if you take them in to get some sort of testing, doctor, physician, psychologist may ask them certain things, right? Or pull out certain objects to see what the child does. Give them a listening sort of device in order to hear, tweak the sound of it, right? To see how well you can hear. But this will all instruct sort of our capacity for learning, to know if a child is above average or below average based on the standards we have of different measures of development. Right? So working memory capacity is very important for reasoning, verbal skills, things of that nature. All right, social and cultural sort of context. Before I begin this, I'll just ask you to talk within your groups on a question that I had. Hey, how important is culture to all of this? The development of learning for an infant. And tell me ways that it is important, maybe based on your own culture. What are some of the differences you see within cultures in terms of how it shapes infants' learning abilities? You understand the question? Okay, so let's talk about that in our group. Culture, how important? What are the differences that you see? Right? You say, hey, in my culture, we were raised and reared this way so that we were able to learn in this way, right? Do you find that it's, a benefit, a deficit? So think of that. How important is culture? What are, the cultural differences and how important they are towards this whole development for the infant? And think of some examples. Right? Think of language, think of play, think of social interactions actions with family members or caregivers or pre-K or daycares. Yeah, think, hey, one of the bullet points was saying, hey, did you have a lot of adult instruction or not in your culture? Were you directed to just like, hey, just go do this? I'm gonna show you how to do it, leave it? Or you like totally engaged with your mom or your dad or your caregiver? Like, are those some of the things that happen within even your own life or your own culture? All right. What are some of your thoughts over here? What are you thinking?
You said that culture like takes a big part of like how someone is like not raised, but like how they like develop and their personality.
Hmm. Maybe from your own cultures, is there any sort of methods or?
So I feel like we were kind of raised in a culture where like everyone's kind of involved and they all like kind of lead you to like what to do and what everyone expects from you.
All right, so it's highly involved in groups in your culture. Why do you? What's the reasoning behind it?
Because I feel like when in a kind of culture where like in school and I feel like everyone like you know how they say you grow like helps someone grow up.
Yeah.
Very like the whole village is helping you grow up.
All right. You say, hey, I come from a collective society. The group, family's more important than individuals, right? The group's more important than one single person. Everybody should contribute, right? If one person falls, we need to help that person because it means the group failed, right? If one person fails, everybody fails. So in this sense, we're like, hey, highly involved in groups and collective because essentially this is how we want you to be in this culture, right? We want you to be family oriented. Don't deviate and become some narcissist, individualized, Americanized person. Okay, good. For your own adaptation, for your own environment that you're going to be in as an adult. What about back there? Mm-hmm. All right, so you say, hey, it's a generational thing, right? They're raising you maybe specifically for the purpose of survival within those group systems. You're like, well, what about everybody else that you have to interact with in society? Like, I don't know, you're gonna have to gain that knowledge through experience, I guess, later. Or you're like, hey, you don't necessarily deal with those people, right? Just kind of focus on your own people. We say, hey, that we can see that as adults, how people take on the shapes of those instructions. Anything from your culture that you can identify as some sort of pattern of instruction or learning? Okay. Something like that. Here.
We kind of two things. One of the things Americans tend to be like very selfish and be able to express themselves, and a lot of other cultures don't. They don't like talking about. They don't like talking about themselves. So some infants might, they'll see that and they'll have problems expressing their emotions. Um, and another thing, while mimicking like those around you, they'll take on whatever, their parents believe
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So especially like if you're homeschooled,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually good to have outside influences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably a point where like your homeschooled culture isn't,
Okay.
the best thing for you.
Yeah, you're like, hey, in some cultures, they really do like the homeschool, right? They feel that the parents can give the best instruction, but you're like, well, that's a problem because once again, we're social, emotional creatures, and there's a lot of different people out there that we should be getting information from. You're like, this is limited information, mom and dad, extremely limited, right? A good balance is to have a healthy amount of all types of information. You don't have to be expert at one thing. You should have a healthy balance. And the other part you said is expressions. Well, hey, problem in the collective. Like I grew up in a collective society, a collective culture. What if you start having some individual internal mental issues? They're like, hey, we don't go to therapists in this culture. We don't do that. We don't believe in that. Psychology? What is that? Pray on it. Superstitions. Hey, let's do a little ritual, right? You'll be fine. You have something else. Being like, hey, this leads to real issues. Someone's internalizing depression, and now they're shunned. Keep them in house because, we say it's all about the group. Don't make us look bad with your quote unquote depression, anxiety, identity issues, social emotional issues, because that seems like a self thing. And we don't do the self thing over here. Right, so that could become a huge issue, right? So we say those instructions with a lack of expressions about who you are individually going to lead to some issues later, right? Or it can be good for other reasons. We say it's not bad, but it can have some problems later, especially if you go from collective to individualistic. Hey, I was born in such and such country. I moved to the United States. My peers and my social groups express themselves as individuals, and I kind of like it. I want to do it too. You're going to conflict with your family, social groups. Back there. Can you think of one example? All right. Hey, religion is huge. What, 3 billion if you put the Christians and the Muslims together, 3.5 billion people. That's quite a bit of humans out of close to 8 billion. Extremely important because we say religion usually dictates, right? Your patterns of life, your patterns of values is what you value. And if you're like, hey, if you are instructed as a young child, even before it would say, hey, you start going through these oral, anal, phallic stages, which are psychosexual, and that essentially that you may have sexual curiosities or energies, and you're told to subvert them and suppress them. You do it long enough, and then it explodes, right? It spills out, and you do the complete opposite of what you're instructed religiously, right? You begin to hate those sort of dictates because we say it's a huge stressor if you feel that what you believe is not how you really think or behave, right? That's a huge cognitive stressor. If you feel like, hey, I believe in something, but you don't practice it, right? You do the complete opposite. You're living with a great amount of anxiety every day of your life because you still have this structure that you live by that governs you. So religion is highly influential. Because religion also shows you how to judge others too, right? You have certain values because your religious belief, you're kind of judging people who don't live according to that. And that affects your emotional life and your social life as well too. Okay. Thoughts?
We said every culture has their own point of view, their own perspectives. Whatever culture you're raised in, you probably will be tied to that culture because you're not taught any other parameters how to navigate any other culture.
Could you give any examples from your own culture?
I grew up in a black household, and some of them like touch and go, and some of them like really family oriented. So it just depends on like your luck of the draw, whatever card you dealt.
All right, so we say, hey, maybe in a black household it's very random.
Yeah.
All right, it's hit or miss. Maybe there might be like, hey, not too many expressions, right? Yeah, you like don't express yourself too emotional. We don't do that over here. Like, how come we don't do that? Because over here is socioeconomic issues, which means you have to be strong, right? You can't express in ways that are not showing some sort of strength, because this is a harsh environment, right? If you don't adapt to this harsh environment, essentially get ran over. Who wants to get ran over? They live in an environment. What were you gonna say?
I was just saying there's no room for when we said you have to adapt. No room for your emotions.
Yeah. Like, hey, makes sense. Oh, you want to express some emotions? No. Hold them, repress them. Oh, well, when are they going to come out then? They'll come out in violence, right? They'll come out in emotional instability.